The largest private home ever built in New York City is a department store now. It stood on the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street and ran the length of a city block. The house had gone up in 1883 for one family, with more rooms than its own household could ever use and a staff to match. It lasted just over 40 years. In 1926, the widow who owned it could no longer carry the cost, and she sold it. The walls came down. The grandest private house the city ever built is now a photograph in a library and a store still open for business on the spot this afternoon. And that house was not the only one. All told, the Vanderbilts raised something like 24 mansions across the city, a whole row of them along 5th Avenue, so many the stretch got a name of its own, Vanderbilt Row. One by one across the first half of the century, the palaces came down, sold off as the family could no longer pay to keep them. Walk that avenue today and there is nothing left, not a doorway, not a cornerstone, to say the richest family in America once lived along it. The name carved over those vanished doors was Vanderbilt. None of that money was ever going to reach you. A story like this one runs on a quiet fantasy, that a great name is enough to keep a great pile in the family forever. It was not enough for the Vanderbilts either, but what happened to their fortune after it ran dry is a stranger thing than just losing it, and it is the part the famous version leaves out. Here is what the empty avenue does not tell you. Everyone knows the Vanderbilts lost it all. Almost no one knows that one branch of the family held on to the grandest house the Vanderbilts ever built, 400 miles to the south, and still owns it and still runs it today, 4 generations on. So how does that happen? How does a family lose every palace, every railroad, and every dollar of the greatest fortune the country ever produced and hold on to the one house that by every rule of this story should have been the very first thing to go? To understand the answer, you first have to know how much there was to lose, and the short version is almost too large to picture. Staten Island, the 1790s. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the son of a ferryman, went to work on the water as a boy and never stopped. He bought a boat, then a fleet, then steamships, then railroads, and he ran all of it with a ruthlessness that frightened the men around him. By the time he died in 1877, at the age of 82, he had built the single largest fortune in the United States. About $105 million, at a moment when a comfortable family house cost a few thousand. He left almost all of it, 95% of it, to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, because the old man understood a cold rule his descendants would spend the next century forgetting. A fortune kept whole holds its power. A fortune split gives it away. And the son proved his father right in the best possible way, and then broke the same rule in the worst. In under 9 years, William Henry doubled the money to around $200 million, and for that stretch, he was the richest man in America. Then, at the end of his life, he could not bring himself to do to his own children what his father had done to his, to raise up one heir and leave the rest with scraps. So he divided the $200 million among all 8 of them. The machine his father had built to hold the fortune together was switched off, on purpose, out of nothing worse than kindness. That was the first crack in everything, and the family read it as generosity. The grandchildren who inherited the pieces had no interest in ferries or freight or the hard work of running anything. They built palaces up and down 5th Avenue, summer cottages in Newport, marble hauled in from Italy, none of it producing a dollar, all of it only costing year after year, while the money flowed out and never came back. And underneath the spending ran a quieter leak. Every generation, the fortune was divided again and again into smaller hands, while the family grew larger and the houses kept eating. The clock was already running on the whole fortune. The family just could not hear it yet. By the time you reached the great-grandchildren, the arithmetic had already done its quiet work. Take Reginald Vanderbilt, a great-grandson of the Commodore. He gambled and he drank and he ran through what he was handed without ever earning a dollar of his own. When he died in 1925 at the age of 45, the New York Times ran the number across its front page. He had left his children $6,250,000. That was the sum that went to his two young daughters, and even it was locked in a trust he had not been allowed to touch. 2 generations after $105 million, you are down to $6 million split 2 ways, and still falling. The fortune was not stolen, and it did not crash in any market. It was spent, and divided, and spent again by people who had never learned how it was made. Chances are you have heard some version of how this ends. In about 3 generations, from the Commodore's death in 1877 to the 1920s, the richest family in America spent its way back down to ordinary, and that is where almost every telling stops. But the collapse was only ever half of it. A family does not vanish the day its money does. The Vanderbilts still had children, and those children had to decide what to do with a world-famous name and an empty bank account behind it. The question that matters is not how they lost it. That part is easy, and you already know it. The real question is what a person does on the morning after the fortune is gone. And a few of these people answered that question better than anyone in the spending generations ever had. 3 of them are worth your time, and the last one is the one nobody ever tells you about. Start with Reginald's younger daughter, because she grew up trapped inside the collapse and drew the right lesson out of it. Her name was Gloria Vanderbilt, born in 1924, and she was famous before she could read. When her father drank himself into the grave, he did not leave her nothing. He left his 2 daughters as heiresses to a half share each in a $5 million trust, and that money came attached to a war. In 1934, her own mother and her aunt, the sculptor Gertrude Whitney, fought each other in open court for custody of the little girl and for control of the fortune that came with her. Through 7 full weeks of testimony, so lurid the newspapers of the day called it the trial of the century. Gloria lost her mother to that verdict and was handed to the aunt, the original poor little rich girl. But the poor part was more headline than fact. By the time she came of age, her inheritance had grown to about $4,717,000. She was not a broke Vanderbilt scraping by on a famous name. She was an heiress, and she had every reason to do what 4 generations before her had done, and coast. Instead, she did the most un-Vanderbilt thing anyone in the family had done in 100 years. She went to work. Every Vanderbilt of the spending generations before her had lived on what the trust threw off and let the famous name carry them the rest of the way her father had let it carry him into the ground. Gloria did the opposite. In 1976, she put her own name on a line of blue jeans, her signature stitched right across the back pocket. At the precise moment, American women decided a designer label belonged on a pair of jeans. The timing was almost too perfect, and the jeans were an immediate hit. And then she did what a real brand does. She put the name on everything. Blouses, sheets, shoes, leather goods, one product after another. A whole line of perfumes, 8 of them, that a cosmetics giant launched under her name between 1982 and 2002. By the end of it, Gloria Vanderbilt was no longer a dead railroad fortune at all, but a living label for sale in half the stores in America. W Magazine put it in a single line. It became a $100 million empire. Sit with that number for a moment. $100 million, about the size of the entire fortune the Commodore had clawed together from a single ferry boat, rebuilt inside a few short years by one of his own descendants. But this is the part almost no one ever mentions. She did not build that empire on the family money. The trust had already handed her that $4,717,000 717,000 of her own. The 100 million on top of it she made herself, under her own name, on products she designed and sold. The one Vanderbilt who out-earned the collapse did it by treating the name as a brand to build and never as a trust to drain. Gloria Vanderbilt had a son, and if you can name a single living Vanderbilt heir, the odds are that it is him. Anderson Cooper, the news anchor, a great-great-great-grandson of the Commodore himself. The tidy version of his part in this story is the one you have already heard. He is the heir who looked at the family curse and turned the whole fortune down. And he has never once hidden what he thinks. He has said outright that his mother made it clear to him there was no trust fund, none of that. He told Howard Stern on the radio back in 2014 that inheriting money is, in his own words, an initiative sucker and a curse. If he had grown up believing there was some pot of gold sitting out there with his name on it, he said he does not know that he would have been motivated to do anything at all. Years later, he said he plans to hand his own children close to nothing, and he has lived by every word of it, building his own name in television, on his own work, the same way his mother built hers in fashion, rather than sitting and waiting on a fortune that was never coming. But the tidy version leaves out the one fact that turns it inside out. There was no great fortune left for him to turn down. When Gloria Vanderbilt died in 2019 at the age of 95, she left the bulk of her estate to that same son, and it was reported at about $1.5 million. The great-great-great-grandson of the man who once held the largest fortune in America inherited a sum his ancestor might have spent on a single grand staircase. He did not walk away from a Vanderbilt fortune. By the time the name reached him, there was no fortune there to walk away from. That is the answer everyone already has, and it is only half of it. The real survivor of this family is not the heir who inherited almost nothing. It is the one who inherited the single worst asset in the entire estate and turned it into the only thing that lasted. So did anyone in this family manage to hold on to a piece of it? While the New York Vanderbilts were tearing their palaces down, a very different story was taking shape 400 miles to the south, in the mountains of North Carolina, around the largest house any Vanderbilt ever built, and the woman who walked away from it and never looked back. Her father was George Vanderbilt, the youngest of William Henry's 9 children, and he was the odd one in that family, a shy, bookish man who cared next to nothing for railroads and everything for paintings and rare books, a man who kept a private library of more than 20,000 volumes. His own father had left him $5 million outright, plus the income from $5 million more, and George took that inheritance and did the most Vanderbilt thing imaginable with it. He built, but he built on a scale that makes the Fifth Avenue palaces look like ordinary row houses. It took 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons a full 6 years, from 1889 to 1895, to raise him a French chateau deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. 250 rooms, more than 178,000 square feet of floor beneath a single roof, close to 4 acres of it indoors, the largest home ever built in the entire country. And a house that size needs a kingdom around it, so he bought one, 125,000 acres of mountain and forest, assembled parcel by patient parcel out of close to 700 separate pieces of land. He named the whole creation Biltmore. It was, and it still is, the largest private home in all of America. It was also, from the very day it was finished, a money pit of historic proportions, the exact kind of magnificent, useless monument this family had made its specialty. George Vanderbilt had one child, a daughter named Cornelia Vanderbilt, and when he died in 1914, the enormous house and all its acres passed to her. She grew up inside that echoing place. In 1924, she married a British diplomat named John Cecil, right there on the estate, in front of the whole county, and in time she had 2 sons. 6 years after the wedding, with the estate hemorrhaging money in the teeth of the Great Depression, she and her husband did a very practical thing. At the request of the city of Asheville, they opened Biltmore to the public, sold tickets at the door, and let ordinary paying strangers walk through the family's marble halls, all in the hope of making the enormous house cover its own bills. And then, in 1934, Cornelia's marriage came apart, and she did something no one had expected. She divorced her husband, left Biltmore, and never once returned to it. Overseas, she dyed her hair a bright, defiant pink and changed her name outright to Nilcha. For the rest of her days, she lived abroad under that invented name, married twice more in 1949 and 1972, and when she died in England in 1976, she had not set foot inside Biltmore in more than 40 years. She did not live to see the full scale of what her sons would make of it. It turned out to be very close to the best thing that ever happened to the Vanderbilt name, and she did not stay to watch it happen. Here is the thing about that house. It had already been open to paying visitors since 1930, and it was still, decade after decade, losing money. Tourists filing through the front hall were not enough. By the middle of the century, Biltmore was bleeding more than $250,000 a year, every single year, just to keep the roof sound and the rooms heated. In 4 decades of selling tickets, it had never once turned a profit. It was the single worst asset in everything the Vanderbilt family had left. A liability so enormous that keeping it looked like madness, and selling it off looked like the only sane thing to do. The son who would save that house was named William Cecil, and he did not wait for anyone to die before he began. In 1960, while his mother was still alive and the place was still hers, he gave up a comfortable banking career at Chase Manhattan up in New York, moved to the mountain for good, and took on the money pit, the beautiful ruin nobody in their right mind would have wanted. And what he then did was the one thing no Vanderbilt of the spending generations had ever done in 100 years. He refused to treat Biltmore as a monument to be admired and subsidized until it bankrupted him the way the trophies had bankrupted his cousins. The house, he decided, would have to earn its own keep like any other business on earth. And he went at it like a man building a company up from bare ground. He marketed it hard, put the house in the newspapers, courted the travel writers, and set out to turn a private home into the kind of place a family would drive across a whole state to see. The old fields went back to work as a producing farm. New restaurants and shops opened their doors on the grounds. Every one of those pieces existed to do the one thing the palace builders had never once in their lives asked a house to do: pay for itself. A monument only takes in servants and coal and taxes until one day it has taken everything. A business gives something back, and a thing that gives something back can go on standing. That was the whole of the insight, and it had taken this family the better part of 80 years to stumble onto it. It was slow, and it was humbling. For a long stretch, the house lost a little less money each year than the year before, and nothing more. Then, one year, the ledger tipped the other way. By the estate's own account, in 1969, after years of grinding effort, Biltmore turned a real profit for the first time in its history. That profit was $16.34. Read that again, $16, set against a $250,000 annual loss. But $16 in the black is a whole different universe from any number at all in the red, and William Cecil understood to the penny what it meant. His rule hardened into the family creed, and that creed is the precise, word-for-word opposite of everything the palace builders had ever believed. In his own words, "We don't preserve Biltmore to make a profit. we make a profit to preserve Biltmore. That one sentence is the entire difference between this branch of the family and all the others. The grandchildren up on Fifth Avenue held their houses as trophies, and the trophies ate them alive. Look at what became of the grandest of the Newport cottages, the Breakers. By the 1920s, the property taxes on it alone had climbed past $80,000 a year. The family carried the place as long as it could, and then in 1948 gave it to a preservation society under a lease of $1 a year. In 1972, the heirs gave up and sold it outright for $365,000, a fraction of what the marble inside it had once cost to import. It is a museum now, run by strangers, the single most visited attraction in the state of Rhode Island, and not 1 cent of what it earns flows to a Vanderbilt. That was the fate of every great Vanderbilt trophy but one. William Cecil held his as a business instead of a trophy, and the business saved it. By the end of the 1970s, it was drawing more than 350,000 visitors a year, and it only climbed from there. The formal division came only at the end. When Cornelia died in 1976, the family's holdings were divided between her 2 sons, and where the older brother took the estate's farm operations, William kept the house he had already spent 16 years pulling back from the brink. And he kept building. In 1985, he turned the estate's old dairy barn into a winery, which became one of the most visited in the entire country. And years after that, the estate opened a hotel of its own, more than 200 rooms, right there on the grounds. Between them, the brothers built, in the estate's own words, the profitable, self-sustaining enterprise their grandfather had first imagined and never got. Today, Biltmore is still standing, still the largest private house in America, and it still belongs, outright and whole, to the direct descendants of the man who built it. More than 1 million people now pay to walk through it every year. William Cecil handed control of the company to his son in 1995, and that son, Bill Cecil Jr., runs it today, while his sister, Denny Cecil Pickering, chairs the board above him. They are the 4th generation to hold the house, with a 5th already coming up behind them. Of the whole vast Vanderbilt fortune, the palaces and the railroads and the hundreds of millions of dollars, this single house is what survived. One house, kept by the one branch that made it pay. So step back now and look at the whole family from a distance, because the pattern in it is the entire lesson. Every Vanderbilt who treated the fortune as a thing to hold, a trophy, a birthright, a comfortable pile to sit on top of, watched it vanish out from under them. The palaces came down, the railroads passed into other hands, and the family reunions filled up with people who carried the most famous name in the history of American money and almost none of the actual money itself. And the Vanderbilts who have anything at all to show for the name today are every last one of them, the ones who treated it instead as a thing to work. Gloria, who earned a second fortune outright under her own signature. Anderson Cooper, who was grateful the curse had burned itself out before it ever reached him, and who inherited $1.5 million where his ancestor had once held $100 million. And William Cecil, who took the single worst asset in the estate and made it pay, and by making it pay, was the only one who managed to keep anything at all. It was never about the money. The Commodore had more of it than any American then alive, and inside 3 short generations it was gone, because a fortune with nothing built to hold it is not a possession. It is a countdown. The families that last are never the ones who inherit the most. They are the ones who learn to make their own money, the way Gloria did, or the ones who learn to make what they did inherit earn its own keep, the way William Cecil did with the one house nobody else wanted. Everyone in between, everyone who just held the pile and admired it and waited for it to take care of them, watched it run straight out through their fingers. That is the whole distance between a house that ends up a faded photograph in a Fifth Avenue library and a house that is still full right now, this very minute, of people lined up and paying at the door just to walk through it. The fortune was never the thing that lasted in this family. The work was. Which leaves one last question, the one this whole story has been stepping around the entire time. How did one single family build a fortune that enormous in the first place and then burn straight through it, right to the last dollar, so that a row of the grandest houses in America could vanish and leave almost no mark behind? That collapse, the building of it and the spending of it, the whole long fall from a single ferry boat to an empty avenue, is a story all its own. And it is the one to watch next.